So we have the guards who are after the halflings because the halflings stole their gold. The halflings have used some of that gold to pay the barbarians to help them ambush the guard. The halflings also have that mystical tome, the Nookinomicon, so they've called in the necromancer to help them as well, with the lure of giving them a good price on buying the book. Added to that, we have the vampire hunters, who are definitely sure this time they're on the trail of Count Ramstein. All of these groups come together in a small, deserted seaside town, home to some rather odd-looking local people. Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, it's time for the Innsmouth Showdown. Hi, I'm Rob Poyton. Thanks for joining me today on Dragon's Teeth, where we have a report from our last playtest of my We Want the Gold Fantasy Skirmish rules. Now, if you've been following to this point, you'll know that this is the third game. It's also the third game where we've had the same players, I'm pleased to say, playing the same factions, so it made sense to link each of these games together. In game one, the Haunted Graveyard, you may remember that the guards had stashed their ill-gotten gains somewhere in the cemetery. It just so happened that the halfling thieves, the sneaky finders, lived up to their name and found them, took them away. They also found that dreaded book, the Nookinomicon, that the necromancer was looking for. In the second game, Death in the Marshes, the halflings had fled to hide out in the marshes where there was an old temple. The guards, of course, are following them. The barbarians are still chasing the guards. They've got a beef with the guards. Everyone else is involved as well. A mummy popped up because Nocturnus, the leader of the necromancer faction, met his demise in the cemetery at the hands of a zombie, ironically enough. So his friend, the Baron, took over leadership of the group, and they were after some mummy dust, which would help with the spell to resurrect Nocturnus, and they were successful in getting that. So that leads us on to the third game, and probably the final one for the moment. Now, in terms of the rules, these test games have been very, very useful. The guys have been coming up with some good ideas for the rules, and obviously how things work in your head, how they look on the page, and then how they actually play out on the table can be three different things. So yeah, very useful for tweaking some of the rules, in particular the melee rules. I was pleased to see across all three games the basic mechanics held up their sound, but there has been an element of tinkering. Now, one thing I've added in, because these three scenarios are connected, is kind of a bit of a campaign system. I wanted to avoid things like experience points and things like, well, you got 100 gold pieces from that last scenario, here's a shopping list. You know, because then you've got to list out broadsword costs this, a dagger costs that, a mule and a backpack cost this, and so on and so on. What I've done instead is looked at the performance of each faction at the end of the scenario. Did they get their objectives? Did they get some other people's objectives as well? Did they come away with gold? Did they find any extra bits and pieces? So, of course, any items that they found, they get to keep. If they found a spell scroll, for example, they get to keep that for the next game. But I thought, depending on their level of success, rather than dish out reputation points or something like this, I'd give them a choice of items. So, if, as the Hobbits did, that faction performed very well, then they might get a list of 5 or 6 items, and they can choose 3 or 4 of those. If they didn't do very well at all, they might get a list of 3 items and they can choose one of them. This way, as the game master, you can keep everything kind of in keeping with the sort of setting you want. You've not got a faction to say, oh, we've got 5,000 gold pieces, we're going to hire a dragon for the next adventure. Okay, because this isn't quite a role-playing game in that sense, though it has elements of that. So, based on their performance last time, each faction has also been given a list of items to choose. These range from armour and shields, through to weapons. There's some silver-tipped weapons, for example, which may or may not come in useful in certain situations. And also a couple of low-level magic swords as well, which basically give a bonus of 1 to the attacker for hitting. But perhaps more importantly, now we're getting into the game, of course, there are some creatures that can only be hit by magic weapons. As well as that, we've got some potions, we've got spell scrolls, and I thought I'd start throwing in some other items as well. So the barbarians this time get the choice of, I think there's a couple of potions and a bag full of mushrooms. And of course, Damo chose the mushrooms and then said, which I thought was great, what do they do exactly? To which I said, well, that's a very good question, because we rolled on a table to see the effects of those, which could range from anything for queuing up for a couple of turns to going absolutely berserk to, well, all sorts of things. I don't want to spoil the surprise. By the same token, one of the items for the Necromancer faction was zombie juice. Again, I was quite vague about what effects that might have, but you can be sure that whoever you administer it to is probably not going to be very happy about it. Oh, and the halflings, as I said, they did very well. They got to choose 4 items. I think that was some armor, a magic sword, and also on the list was a potion of invisibility. Now, again, unbeknownst to the halflings, because I wanted to make magic a little bit dodgy to use, it could be that that potion of invisibility is not all that it seems, but we'll get to that later on. Now, the other aspect of linking scenarios together and forming a campaign is possibly looking at the general statistics, the primary statistics or skills of characters as well. Can they increase their strength, their agility, or can they develop new traits? So that's something I'm looking at adding in as well, possibly. But again, I don't really want this game to get overcomplicated. You know, the idea is you can have a quick, simple skirmish game without having to go full AD&D or Rollmaster or any of those systems. When it comes to traits in the initial scenario, I allocated the traits to each character. What I did this time was said to each player, you can choose a number of traits, I think it's 4 traits, to distribute however you like amongst your characters. If you choose a disadvantage, then you get an extra trait. Now, the vampire hunters under Paul use this to the extreme. They chose something like 3 disadvantages, so I got a whole bunch of extra traits, which I thought was very good thinking, good tactical thinking there. And likewise, of course, the players get to choose which spells their magic users are going to take with them. If a magic user has a spell factor of 2, they can choose 2 spells. Those spells are single use. You know, you cast them and they're gone from the mind until you go back to base and relearn them. But of course, they can also be carrying scrolls, and of course, they might find spell scrolls scattered around during the scenario. And for the setup, I'm using my Innsmouth build. This is a good chance to give it a testing, if you like, before I set it up at the Innsmouth Literary Festival. All the buildings are done now, still 1 or 2 other bits and pieces to do as well. But one thing I did find down at the club, Bedford Gladiators, because we played this last Monday, is there's a new mat has been bought, and it's of cobbled streets, like a medieval town. Perfect for the Innsmouth build, so I've used that. Now, whether I make my own cobbles, as I plan to do with my rubber matting and my little roller, I might still do that. But if time is against me, then I shall hopefully be able to use that mat for the ILF to do the setup there. Oh, just before we get into the report, I just want to mention about the filming as well. It is quite difficult to run a game and film it at the same time, but I managed to get a fair amount of footage. However, the lighting down at the club is not the best. During the day, you've got bright sunshine coming in, with big windows on one side. There's no curtains or blinds. And there's some sort of fluorescent type lights overhead, which are not very good as it gets dark. So it's very contrasty. Now, I've been playing around with the settings on my new camera. That's what I use to film this. And the quality is not great. To be honest, I should have used my usual camera there. I know what I'm doing when it comes to white balance and anything else. So the footage I've got here, it's not very good. It's very dark. It's a bit grainy. So I apologise for that. But hopefully it will give you an idea of what was going on. Anyway, let's get into it and let's start by meeting our factions. And we start with Andy playing the Sneaky Finders, the Halfling Thieves, who have been doing very well for themselves. In the first scenario, they not only got the guard's treasure stash, they also got the Nookie-Nomicon. And now they've made a deal with the Necromancer team and the Barbarians. The plan is to lure the guards into the village where they're going to be ambushed by at least 3 factions. So for the Halflings, this is really a way to get the guards off their backs, because of course the guards are a bit miffed at having their treasure stolen and have been in hot pursuit of the Halflings ever since. Next up is Matt playing the Necromancer faction, and Nocturnus is back. You may remember he perished in the first scenario, chewed upon by a zombie, though he's looking a little bit the worse for wear, but in scenario 2 his friend the Baron got hold of that mummy dust and has been able to resurrect Nocturnus. Now, they're here at the invite of the Halflings, and they've agreed to assist the Halflings in return for getting a good price for that arcane tome, the Nookie-Nomicon. Damo is in charge of the Barbarians. Now, the Barbarians lost a warrior last time, and in replacement this time, they have a shaman. Yes, they've got their very own magic user. Also here at the invite of the Halflings, and also here they want to complete their vengeance against the city guards. They have a particular reason to be miffed with them, and although they've come close, they've certainly clashed with the guards on the previous 2 occasions. They've never been quite able to finish the job, so let's see if they can put that right today. Speaking of which, we have Neil and the city guard. Now there's a slight change here because they've had 1 or 2 casualties. So they've got a different character or 2, but effectively they're still the same. Heavily armoured, they've got no magic user, they've got a couple of healing potions, and a potion of strength I think as well. That's pretty much it. So while they have no magic and they are a bit slow, they are very heavily armoured and quite tough opponents. And they're really here because they've heard that the Halflings have set up a hideout in the village. Time to get their gold back. Finally, it's Paul once again bringing out the vampire hunters led by Professor Van Halen. Quite simple objective. They've tracked down Count Raumstein. Definitely they think this time to the village. They've had a couple of near misses before, but they're pretty convinced he's lurking around here somewhere. And of course, should they bump into the necromancers, well, as you might imagine, there's a natural enmity between those 2 groups. So we shall see how that plays out as well. Quick overview of the table, and of course the denizens will be revealed as we go along. Got the Esoteric Order of Dagon in the middle there. The 3-storey house just in front of it, that's going to play a pivotal role. We've got the Gilman Hotel just behind that. We've got our houses on the right. They're all very crumbly and abandoned. Got the church and the graveyard. And we've got some marshland at each end of the table as well. And we do have up in one corner, just at the edge of that marshland, a hill. But the top of the hill is shrouded in a strange fog. So what is actually up there is not visible at the moment. Will anyone go and take a look, I wonder? And starting positions, we've got the Barbarians just on the left there, coming on at that edge. We've got the Necromancer beyond. We've got the City Guard coming up the main street. The Vampire Hunters are coming in behind that row of dilapidated houses. And the Halflings, they've got a lookout up in the church steeple, and the rest of them are just hanging around the cemetery there, hanging around the graveyard. So, the scene is set. Simple plan from the Halflings: stick the treasure chest out in the middle of the street. Tommy is there taunting the guards. We've got some tripwires and traps set up on the approach, and the rest of the gang are hiding here and there ready to spring out, and of course those barbarians are coming in from the left as well. And yes, the guards do approach, but very slowly down that street. just using one action point of movement. They're obviously a suspicious bunch. The vampire hunters move into the cover of those buildings, coming through the alleyways, and Solomon, their crossbow man, actually climbs up on the side ladders to take up a firing position on a balcony. Nocturnus, not having learnt his lesson in scenario 1 it seems, decides to wander off on his own, away from his bodyguard and from the others. He sends them left, he goes right, and as we see, he pays the price of that in a little bit. The barbarians, yet again a simple plan, they're just going to come down that side street, catch the guards in the flank. However, they do pause to look at the odd statue outside the Temple of Dagon, and of course that does reach out some tentacles and attack the nearest figure, but they manage to deal with that pretty easily. The guards continue their steady advance. They notice some of the necromancer crew on the right, but they've just got eyes for the chest at the moment. They've got no real beef with the necromancers. They want the gold. However, as the guard advance, the barbarians pop into view, which captures their attention, and you might notice Nocturnus at the front of the Gilman Hotel there, well in sight of the vampire hunter crossbowman, who takes a couple of pot shots. One actually pins Nocturnus's hand to his body. We got a nice 20 roll there. So yeah, not a good start for Nocturnus. I think the sight of the barbarians confirms the guards' suspicions, so some of them start working behind those buildings, getting off of the main street. One does continue to walk towards the chest, and is going to trigger one of those tripwires in a moment. The barbarians, having seen the guards, are now rushing out towards them, and poor old Nocturnus, he sort of gets caught in the middle a bit here. Meanwhile, the halfling druid has summoned an earth elemental that is protecting the chest, which is empty of course. There's our crossbowman on his vantage point. The barbarians hate sorcery. Nocturnus unfortunately looks like a sorcerer, so they decide to attack him. While that's going on, the vampire hunters come out into the main street, or some of them do, have a little chat with the halflings. Again, they've got no real conflict between them. They're looking for vampires, not halflings. Now the combat starts developing, particularly on the right side here, beginning with the earth elemental against the guard. More guards are going to come in there. We've got another guard coming up to the druid there. He actually sets off the traps as he comes in. A couple of tripwires fire crossbow bolts. Luckily they both missed him. Nocturnus has retreated, the Baron has taken his place, and is having a little chat with one of the halflings. Well, Tommy the halfling had an invisibility potion, which made Tommy invisible, but unfortunately not his clothes. So anyway, they're having a little chat there about the book. The Baron is now taking the brunt of the attack from the barbarians, and also the vampire hunters have clocked him as well. Professor Van Halen and the Doctor, meanwhile, have been confronted by the terrifying figure of Grond, the undead knight. However, they have in their possession a dust-to-dust spell scroll, which they manage to successfully cast. Poor old Grond is scattered to the winds. The battle develops down by the old houses. We've got guards, we've got halflings, earth elemental and barbarians, all having a good set to down there. I think the druid threw in a thunderbolt at one point as well. The vampire hunters check out the Esoteric Order of Dagon building. They decide not to go in, and they also decide very wisely not to go near the statues. The Baron, meanwhile, is being, well, pretty much hacked to pieces by the barbarians, while Nocturnus stands round the corner chatting to a halfling. And it's at this point that everyone sees the flickering lights in the strange old house, and our crossbowman up on the balcony can make out, silhouetted against a candle flame, the figure of a vampire. He fires off a sneaky shot, which might or might not do anything. The fog on the hill also clears, revealing a strange, bulgy-eyed figure and his acolytes. It looks like there's some sort of ritual or summoning in progress. Count Ramstein, for it is he, bursts out of the window of the house, flies across to the roof of the Gilman Hotel to take stock. Just down before him, the Baron is on his last legs against 3 barbarians. A bride of Ramstein, who the vampire hunters met before, also flees the house, but she runs straight into two of the vampire hunters, and after a brief struggle they stake her. The guards meanwhile are still taking a bit of a hiding over by the houses from the earth elemental, also some sneaky back attacks from the halfling assassin. So we have a vampire on the roof, which means it's pretty safe from the vampire hunters at the moment. The cleric Father Dio can't get a bead on him. Meantime, Professor Van Halen has bumped into the necromancer crew, who are also having a bit of a fight with the guard. And I see Tommy the Halfling is involved there as well. I think he's backstabbing the guard at the moment. So that's all getting a little bit messy. And Nocturnus is in hand-to-hand combat again. He really hasn't learnt his lesson from fighting last time. Battle still rages behind the houses and in the alleyways between the guards and the halflings. And the guards are still getting the worst of that. And now Chappie up on the hill, no doubt nervous at seeing all these people in this village, calls up some deep ones to protect his summoning. So they start to appear in the marshes at each end of the village, and next turn they're going to be moving forwards to protect their master. But I think everyone was so deep into their combats here they didn't really take too much notice or felt they couldn't do anything to stop what was happening on the hill. So that summoning continued, and so did all the little battles. The guards were pretty much finished off. And then, of course, as the summoning completed, we got a real nasty appeared up on the hill, which was pretty much the cue for everyone to leave, to vacate, dragging their wounded with them, or taking their gold, or taking their book, or whatever else they'd managed to get. There we go then. I think the halflings did very well again. They're really on a run. That's 3 in a row for them. The guards were in a lot of trouble, pretty much wiped out by the end. The vampire hunters, well, they didn't quite get Count Ramstein. They didn't really manage to surprise him. If someone had gone into that house earlier, they would have found him in his coffin. But a certain number of turns have gone past. The sun goes down. The vampire comes up. They did get his bride this time, however. She was well and truly staked. The necromancer team, well, they did end up buying the book from the halflings because they did help out against the guard. And the barbarians are also happy because they got to wreak their revenge against the city guard. So, all in all, a good game. There were a few points of interest I thought came up. One is the necromancer, again, both necromancers sort of went off on their own and got involved in melee combat quite quickly and with, well, for them, pretty devastating results, especially the Baron, who was gone. I'm not quite sure why, as magic users, they're being put out in the front line, especially when they've got a couple of fighters with them, and one in particular, the undead bodyguard. Now, to be fair, he did get blasted with the dust to dust spell, but if the necromancer had been with him, the necromancer could have cast a spell maybe against the professor who cast the dust to dust spell. So, you know, if you've got distance spells, then that's really what your magic users do, right? They keep back a bit and they throw these spells from a distance. The halfling druid or shaman did really well on that. He summoned his earth elemental quite early on. That stuck around for a fair number of turns and, you know, was very active against the guards. He also chucked a thunderbolt at one point as well that hit for quite a few points against the guard. So, you know, that was good use of a magic user, I thought. I think the other thing that came out was don't let your characters wander off on their own. It's classic horror film stuff, isn't it? How about we all split up and I'm going to go down here and I'm going to walk backwards into the dark, scary woods. I'm sure nothing will happen. Characters who are on their own, including one of the guards at one point, very quickly get surrounded by 3 or even 4 attackers. And once they're in that, it's very difficult for them to get out without someone else coming to their assistance. So yeah, it's looking like as a general tactic, it's good to keep your faction fairly close together. Now, the exception to that, and we had one example of this, one of the barbarians has the Berserker trait. I think it's Bjorn the Berserker, funnily enough. But one of the traits that the halflings chose was also Berserker with the leader Tommy, and he went berserk at one point against some of the guards with the ensuing carnage. But of course, the thing is with a Berserker is they just attack whoever's in front of them. So if they've killed their opponent and it happens to be a member of their own faction standing there next, in they go. So yeah, there are some situations where if someone's going into the battle rage, you maybe want to give them a little bit of space. But I would certainly say, unless you've got a thief or someone with good sneak or hide abilities, don't stick them out on point. Certainly don't put your magic user out in the front. The other thing I found was that although those items were chosen, in a lot of cases the players kind of forgot about them. Every now and again Damo would say, oh, I didn't take my magic mushrooms. Again, the halflings did quite well on that. They used a potion of invisibility. Shame it worked only on the person and not the clothes, but there we go. But the guards had a potion of strength that they didn't use. There was some healing potions knocking about that weren't used. And the zombie juice, that wasn't used either. To be fair, that didn't really come up as an option. However, it was interesting to see that once we got into the combat, the focus was very much on that, quite intense. It also meant that by the time the fog cleared on the hill and that ritual summoning was revealed, by the time Count Ramstein popped out, everyone was so engaged in fighting each other, they didn't really take a lot of notice and that. And I suppose in a way, who wants to take the risk of trying to disengage from combat to go and fight a big Cthulhu monster? When I planned a scenario out, one thing I was thinking was that maybe at some point, if the vampire appears and he's quite a big bad vampire, or if it's obvious there's this big summoning ritual going on and deep ones are appearing, perhaps the factions will unite a little bit in order to work together against this mutual threat. Now, that might have happened. Of course, the issue we have on the Monday is time. So we, ran out of time. The place shuts at 11. So that was an issue. It would have been interesting to see if we'd have gone on for another couple of turns, if they would have tried to stop that summoning ritual, or maybe people would have ganged up against the vampire. Anyway, that's what happened. A good result for everyone, mostly, except for the guard. Poor old city guard. Count Ramstein is still floating around, flutting around somewhere. And of course, the summoning worked. So in Innsmouth, that village now, there's a big bad star spawn of Cthulhu on the rampage, at least in that local area. Maybe that will form the basis for another scenario. Who knows? So yeah, the play did reveal another couple of little tweaks that we need. One thing in particular is I keep forgetting about the rule. If you beat someone in the melee, you have the option to push them back. I keep forgetting to mention that. One thing about attacking figures who have not activated yet, who have already activated, you should get more of a bonus perhaps because they're less able to defend themselves. That needs a little bit of looking at. But overall, I think stat-wise and everything else, everything is working fine. Characters are killed, but they are fairly hard to kill. You need to have a few rounds of melee in order to kill someone. The creatures in general, with the exception of the big Cthulhu monster and Count Ramstein, are also pretty easy to kill. If you come up against a skeleton, one hit, maybe two hits, and it's done. They're there more to inconvenience the players and add something into the narrative and the atmosphere rather than act as a real threat to them. Of course, they can be a threat if you find yourself outnumbered, but really their task is to add a bit of atmosphere. In terms of production now, we have our first proof PDF, which we're working through at the moment. As always, 4 people read it and then another person reads it and says, oh, you missed this, this and this. It's the most painstaking part of doing any publication, going through again and again and again, checking all the spelling, checking that everything makes sense. And of course, with this, which is new to me, checking all the numbers as well. Do all the stats make sense? Do all the dice rolls make sense? Because, well, I suppose it's similar to writing a novel or a story. In your head, you know what's happening. You know that the butler is really a ghoul, and you know that this is so-and-so's cousin. But the reader doesn't necessarily know that. So how you give out information in a story is important. But of course, in a game like this, I can't just assume, well, of course you roll a dice when this happens. I have to actually explain that. I think the way it's gone, most people who have played this type of game will be familiar with the mechanics. There's nothing new and outrageous in here. Of course, it's more about the presentation, and as I keep stressing with this set of rules, it's all about that narrative structure and getting that interaction between your different factions. Okay, so that's it for now. Thanks again, huge thanks to the chaps for their input, their excellent ideas, and for all the fun as well. Because again, one of the great things when you run any game, whatever it is when players start inputting their own ideas, and that quite often they're much better than anything I could think of. But I shall give them credit in the rule book. Don't worry about that; they'll all get credit. Hopefully the rules are going to be ready by September. So for August, we're going to be going through again and again and again, got all the proofs done. The artwork is all pretty much finished now. We'll get final layouts done. I've got a couple of people have kindly offered to play test. I'll be getting some early examples out to them to play test as well. So certainly I hope we should be ready for the Innsmouth Literary Festival on the 27th of September. We'll be putting on a demonstration game there where you can come and try the rules and see how it all works. I'll also be putting some tutorial videos up. Now I'm going to film them at a local hall where I've got really good lighting. I've got the nice quiet setup, and I'll go through each element of the rules in turn. Just short 5 or 10 minute videos to give people a taste of how the rules work. So watch out for those coming up as well. Thanks again for watching today. As always, do keep your comments, questions and suggestions coming in. And thanks to all our new subscribers. We've had about 50 new subscribers over the last month. So thanks very much for joining. It really does help promote the channel, and it really does help the channel grow. I'll see you next time.